Coffee splashed my stepdad Rick's shirt. I froze. He yanked a belt, grinning wild. I'm 19, he's 48, mom's gone, Texas nights burned hot. Beer hit, I teased, he grabbed me, sparks flew fast. 2 weeks ignited, dangerously close. Bar night snapped, what crashed us cold? You'll choke. I was 19, restless, and alone with my stepdad, Rick, a 48-year-old ex-mechanic with a rough edge I'd always noticed too much, in our Texas house late that night. Mom had bolted for a work trip, some conference gig, leaving us for 2 weeks. Her last call a casual bet I'd keep it tame, no clue what I'd spark. I'd been pacing, antsy, when I wandered into the kitchen, barefoot in a loose tee and shorts, the clock ticking past 11. Rick stomped in from the garage, grease smudging his hands, his favorite flannel open over a tight tank, hair mussed like he'd been wrestling engines. We'd cracked a couple beers earlier, the buzz humming low, and I'd felt his eyes, sharp, too long, more than a stepdad's should. I grabbed a mug, poured coffee from the pot, my hands shaky from the beer, and turned too fast, sloshed it right onto his chest, soaking that damn shirt he loved. He froze, glared, coffee dripping, and I laughed, nervous, saying oops, bet he'd kill me for that. He smirked, slow and dark, and said killing wasn't it, I bet I'd pay up big now. I grinned, flirty, bumped his arm with my elbow, teasing that paying was my trick, bet he'd cash it quick. He stepped closer, his hip brushing the counter near mine, and said cashing was my mess, bet I'd spill more before dawn. I leaned on the sink, my shoulder grazing his, saying he looked hot mad, bet he'd fixed worse stains than this. He smirked, yanked a drawer open, pulling out an old leather belt, not to scare, just to mess with me, and twirled it, saying stains didn't flirt, bet I'd dodge this one. I bumped his hip, flirty, and told him dodging was dull, bet he'd loop me in anyway. He laughed, low and rough, and snapped the belt light, his hand brushing mine as he tossed it on the counter, teasing I was trouble, bet I'd tangle him up. I smirked, bumped his elbow, saying tangling was my spark, bet he'd light it too. He grabbed my wrist, not hard, playful, pulling me closer, saying I'd better watch it, I bet I'd twist this night raw. My stomach flipped, heat rushing up, and I tugged free, flirty, leaning in, my knee brushing his thigh, teasing that twisting was my rush, bet he'd hold on tight. He smirked, stepped up, his chest an inch from mine, his hand hovering near my arm, and muttered holding was my game, bet I'd drag him down. I bumped his shoulder, teasing, saying dragging was the fun, bet he'd dive in anyway. He leaned closer, his fingers tapping the belt, grazing my wrist, and said diving was my trap, bet I'd snag him good. The kitchen went quiet, beer cans sweating on the counter, and I grabbed one, sipped slow, holding his gaze, saying he looked too good ticked off, bet he'd brew trouble with me. He took it, his hand brushing mine, lingering, and sipped, saying trouble was my brew, bet I'd scorch this place. I bumped his hip again, flirty, saying scorching was my win, bet he'd fan it slow. He smirked, set the can down, his elbow nudging mine, and said fanning was dumb, bet I'd blaze out fast. I leaned in, my arm pressing his, teasing, saying blazing was my thrill, bet he'd stick for it. He stepped back, grabbed the belt, twirled it again, his eyes sharp, saying I was a damn spark, bet I'd light him up too. I grinned, bumped his knee with mine, flirty, and told him lighting was my style, bet he'd burn with me. He smirked, tossed the belt back in the drawer, his hand brushing my shoulder as he shut it, muttering burning was my chaos, bet I'd pull him in deep. I bumped his elbow one more, teasing, saying deep was the point, bet he'd follow anyway. The clock ticked, the night thick, and I stayed there, saying he was too steady, bet he'd shake if I dared. He smirked, leaned on the counter, his chest close, and said shaking was my mess, bet I'd tip this house. I grinned, bumped his hip, flirty, saying tipping was my win, bet he'd play it out. He didn't pull away, just watched, tension snapping, and I knew I'd hooked him, coffee, beer, and all mine. 2 days after the coffee spill, the Texas heat pressed heavy on our house, the late afternoon sun baking the porch where I found Rick tinkering with a pile of old tools. Mom was still off on her work trip, her last text a week bet I'd stay out of mischief, way off base. I stepped out, barefoot in a loose tank and shorts, the air thick with dust and oil, and leaned on the railing near him, my elbow brushing the table he worked at. He was wrist-deep in a wrench, his faded flannel open over a tight tee, grease streaking his forearms, and he didn't look up, just grunted I'd better not touch, bet I'd break it all. I smirked, kicked a pebble off the porch, flirty, saying he looked hot fixing, bet he'd patched wilder wrecks than this. He smirked, twisted the wrench, and said Rex didn't flirt, bet I'd bust this faster than him. I grinned, slid closer, my hip nudging the table's edge, teasing that flirting was my fix, bet he'd tighten it up for me. He glanced over, his hand brushing a rag near my arm, fingers tapping close, and said tightening was my trick, bet I'd loosen him first. I bumped his shoulder with mine, flirty, and told him loosening was my spark, bet he'd crank it anyway. He smirked, wiped his hands, his elbow grazing mine, muttering sparking was my mess, bet I'd owe him for this one. I leaned in, my knee brushing his leg, and grabbed a screwdriver from the pile, twirling it slow, saying owing him was my angle, bet he'd cash it with that grin. He took it, his fingers lingering on mine, teasing, and said cashing was my hustle, bet I'd con him into more. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying conning was the kick, bet he'd bite every turn. He smirked, leaned closer, his arm brushing my side, and muttered biting was my play, bet I'd hook him too deep. I grinned, tapped the rag near his hand, teasing, saying hooking was my rush, bet he'd tug back sharp. The sun dipped, shadows stretching, and I sat on the table edge, my leg dangling near his, saying he looked damn good greasy, bet he'd revved hotter engines than this. He smirked, turned a bolt, his shoulder nudging mine, and said engines didn't sass, bet I'd stall this one out. I bumped his elbow, flirty, and told him stalling was my charm, bet he'd kick it alive for me. He shifted, his hand brushing my arm as he grabbed another tool, warm and rough, saying kicking was my trap, bet I'd drag him down. I leaned closer, my knee pressing his thigh, teasing, saying dragging was my thrill, bet he'd haul me up. He stood, stretching, his chest close as he tossed the wrench down, saying I'd better watch it, bet I'd tangle this porch. I smirked, bumped his hip with mine, flirty, and grabbed a can of beer from the cooler, cracking it slow, saying tangling was my vibe, bet he'd crack one too. He took it, his fingers grazing mine, teasing, and sipped, muttering cracking was my chaos, bet I'd spill it first. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying spilling was my win, bet he'd mop it up. He smirked, leaned on the railing, his elbow brushing my side, and said mopping was my fantasy, bet I'd soak him instead. The breeze kicked up, dust swirling, and I stayed there, sipping, saying he looked too steady, bet he'd shake if I dared him. He smirked, turned, his knee nudging mine, and said shaking was my mess, bet I'd tip this whole yard. I grinned, leaned in, my arm pressing his chest, teasing, saying tipping was my spark, bet he'd light it anyway. He smirked, his hand brushing my shoulder, light, teasing, and muttered lighting was my hustle, bet I'd blaze him out. I bumped his hip one more, flirty, saying blazing was my rush, bet he'd burn with me. The night crept in, stars blinking, and I hopped off the table, saying he was too good at this, bet he'd play my game. He smirked, sipped his beer, his elbow brushing mine, and said playing was my trap, bet I'd snag him tight. I grinned, stayed close, the heat simmering, knowing I'd reeled him deeper, tools down, tension up. For days after the porch tease, the Texas sun was relentless, scorching the backyard where I lounged on a rickety chair, sipping water, the air buzzing with cicadas. Mom was still off on her work trip, her last call a scratchy bet I'd keep the peace, no chance. I'd been replaying Rick's greasy smirk, his belt twirling jabs, and it was sticking harder than I'd admit. He came out, hammer in hand, fixing a loose plank on the fence, his old flannel flapping open, jeans streaked with dirt, sweat beading on his neck. I tilted my head, flirty, saying he looked sexy swinging, bet he'd nailed tougher jobs than that. He smirked, drove a nail in, and said jobs didn't flirt, bet I'd snap this fence just watching. I grinned, stood, sauntering over, my bare foot brushing the grass near his boots, teasing that flirting was my hammer, bet he'd swing it back. He glanced up, his hand brushing a plank by my knee, fingers tapping close, and said swinging was my dodge, bet I'd miss the mark. I leaned on the fence, my elbow nudging his arm, flirty, saying missing was my spark, bet he'd hit it anyway. He smirked, turned the hammer, his shoulder grazing mine, muttering sparks were my mess, bet I'd owe him for this fix. I bumped his hip, teasing, and told him owing was my hook, bet he'd reel it in slow. He grabbed another nail, his fingers brushing my wrist as I handed it over, saying reeling was my hustle, bet I'd tangle him up. I smirked, bumped his elbow, flirty, and said tangling was my kick, bet he'd knot it tighter. He drove the nail, his knee pressing mine through the grass, and smirked, saying knotting was my trap, bet I'd snag him deep. I grinned, leaned closer, my hand grazing his on the plank, teasing, saying snagging was my rush, bet he'd tug back sharp. He turned, his chest an inch from mine, muttering tugging was my game, bet I'd pull him down. The heat pressed, sweat trickling, and I stepped back, grabbing a water bottle from the chair, sipping slow, saying he looked damn good out here, bet he'd fixed hotter days than this. He smirked, wiped his brow, his arm brushing my shoulder as he took it, and said days didn't sass, bet I'd scorch this yard. I bumped his hip, flirty, saying scorching was my vibe, bet he'd fan it anyway. He sipped, his hand brushing mine, teasing, and said fanning was my chaos, bet I'd blaze out quick. I leaned in, my elbow pressing his side, saying blazing was my thrill, bet he'd burn with me. He tossed the hammer down, leaned on the fence, his knee nudging mine, saying I'd better cool it, I bet I'd wreck this piece. I smirked, bumped his shoulder, flirty, and grabbed a twig, twirling it, saying wrecking was my spark, bet he'd patch it up. He snatched it, his fingers grazing mine, teasing, and said patching was my dream, bet I'd bust it first. I bumped his chest with my elbow, flirty, saying busting was my win, bet he'd fix it anyway. He smirked, turned, his arm brushing my back, muttering fixing was my trap, bet I'd drag him in. The sun sank, shadows creeping, and I stayed close, saying he looked too steady, bet he'd shake if I dared him. He smirked, leaned in, his hand brushing my shoulder, light, teasing, and said shaking was my mess, bet I'd tip this fence. I grinned, bumped his hip, saying tipping was my rush, bet he'd hold it up. He smirked, his knee pressing mine, muttering holding was my play, bet I'd slip anyway. I leaned closer, my arm grazing his chest, flirty, saying slipping was my game, bet he'd catch me sharp. The yard hummed, dusk settling, and I stepped back, tossing the twig, saying he was too good at this, bet he'd chase my spark. He smirked, grabbed his hammer, his elbow brushing mine, and said chasing was my hustle, bet I'd reel him too far. I grinned, bumped his shoulder one last time, flirty, saying reeling was my win, bet he'd bite it hard. He turned, hammer swinging, tension thick, and I headed inside, knowing I'd hooked him deeper, fence up, guard down. The day before Mom was due back from her work trip, still wheezing through that flu. I'd hit a peak with Rick after 2 weeks of flirty back and forth in our Texas house. Her last call was a faint bet I'd kept it quiet, wildly wrong. That afternoon, I'd talked him into ditching the tame for a bar run, craving the chaos of a night out. I threw on a denim skirt and a tight top, and he drove us downtown in his beat-up truck, his flannel swapped for a dark jacket, hair slicked back, looking sharper than I'd expected. He pulled into the gravel lot, shot me a glance, saying I'd better not start a riot, bet I'd pull him into one anyway. The bar thrummed, neon buzzing, music pounding, bodies jostling, and I grinned, weaving through, tugging his sleeve, teasing that he looked too cool for this dive, bet he'd dance me out. He smirked, trailed me to the bar, his hand brushing my elbow as we squeezed in, saying dancing was my storm, bet I'd spin him dizzy. I leaned on the counter, my hip grazing his, flirty, and ordered beers, saying he'd need it, I bet he'd loosen up tonight. He took one, his fingers tapping mine as I slid it over, teasing, saying loosening was my hustle, bet I'd reel him flat. I grinned, bumped his arm, saying reeling was my spark, bet he'd sip it down. The beat kicked up, and I pulled him to the floor, the crowd pulsing, my skirt swishing as I swayed, teasing that he looked hot standing stiff, bet he'd move for me. He smirked, stepped in, his hands hovering near my hips, light, guiding, saying moving was my chaos, bet I'd twist him out. I laughed, spun closer, my shoulder brushing his chest, flirty, saying twisting was my vibe, bet he'd turn it back. He matched my step, his knee nudging mine, his grip settling loose, teasing, muttering turning was dumb, bet I'd trip him up. I grinned, leaned in, my hand grazing his arm, saying tripping was my rush, bet he'd catch me sharp. The lights flashed, sweat beading, and I spun, my back brushing his front, swaying slow, saying he was too steady, bet he'd shake loose now. He smirked, his hand sliding to my waist, warm through my top, teasing, saying shaking was my mess, bet I'd tip us over. I turned, my elbow pressing his ribs, flirty, saying tipping was my thrill, bet he'd hold me anyway. He pulled me closer, his chest grazing mine, his voice low, muttering holding was my trap, bet I'd drag him down. I smirked, bumped his hip, teasing, saying dragging was my win, bet he'd follow fast. The song thumped, bodies crowding, and I laughed, tossing my hair, saying he looked damn wild in this mess, bet he'd coached louder nights. He smirked, spun me once, his hand brushing my shoulder, light, saying wild was my spark, bet I'd blaze this bar. I leaned in, my knee brushing his thigh, flirty, teasing that blazing was my game, bet he'd fan it slow. His grip tightened, guiding me through a turn, his fingers tapping my hip, muttering fanning was my hustle, bet I'd burn him out. I grinned, swayed closer, my arm nudging his chest, saying burning was my rush, bet he'd stick for it. The music slowed, lights dimming, and I stayed there, breathless, saying he was too good at this, bet he'd take me home lit. He smirked, his hand lingering on my waist, teasing, saying lit was my chaos, bet I'd pull him too far. I bumped his shoulder, flirty, saying pulling was my spark, bet he'd chase it anyway. He leaned closer, his knee pressing mine, muttering chasing was my play, bet I'd twist him raw. I laughed, spun away, heading for the bar, calling back he'd miss my heat, bet he'd catch up. He trailed me, the crowd thinning, and I grabbed another beer, leaning on the counter, my elbow brushing his arm, saying he looked too steady, bet he'd flare for me. He smirked, took one too, his hand brushing mine, teasing, saying flaring was my trap, bet I'd snag him tight. I grinned, bumped his hip, flirty, saying snagging was my win, bet he'd drink it down. The night roared, tension thick, and I knew I'd hooked him deep to dancing, daring, done. After the bar, Mom's return loomed, her work trip cut a day short. Her last text a croaky bet I'd kept it sane, oblivious to the chaos I'd spun with Rick over 2 weeks in our Texas house. We'd rolled in past 3 a.m., buzzed from beer and bar lights, the truck lurching as I giggled, teasing he'd danced too wild, bet he'd crash us just to gloat. He'd smirked, parked crooked, and we'd stumbled inside, the house dark, my head swimming from booze and his pull. I'd felt it all night, his hands, his heat, and I wasn't letting it fade. Barefoot in my skirt and top, I swayed in the hall, unzipping my jacket, flirty, saying he'd owned that floor, bet he'd claim me now. He smirked, kicked the door shut, his jacket sliding off, leaving him in that dark shirt, jeans low, and stepped up, saying claiming was my stunt, bet I'd wreck it fast. I grinned, lurched closer, my hip grazing his, teasing that wrecking was my prize, bet he'd snatch it anyway. He grabbed my wrists, light, playful, tugging me toward his room, muttering I'd gone too far, bet I'd sink us tonight. I laughed, flirty, bumped his chest with my shoulder, saying sinking was my spark, bet he'd dive in too. He smirked, pushed the door open, his hand brushing my arm, guiding me in, saying diving was my trap, bet I'd snag him deep. The room was dim, lamp flickering, and I spun, flopping onto his bed, my skirt riding up an inch, teasing, saying he looked hot chasing, bet he'd catch me here. He smirked, dropped beside me, his knee nudging mine, hands hovering near my hips, light, teasing, saying catching was my chaos, bet I'd twist him out. I grinned, shifted closer, my shoulder pressing his chest, flirty, saying twisting was my vibe, bet he'd roll with it. He leaned in, his hand brushing my waist, warm through my top, muttering rolling was dumb, bet I'd tip us over. I bumped his elbow, teasing, saying tipping was my rush, bet he'd steady me anyway. The bed creaked, beer buzzing through me, and I stretched back, my top slipping up, flirty, saying he was too steady, bet he'd shake for this. He smirked, shifted closer, his knee pressing mine, one hand sliding to my side, light, teasing, saying shaking was my mess, bet I'd drag him down. I grinned, bumped his hip, my fingers grazing his arm, saying dragging was my thrill, bet he'd hold on tight. His hand moved, brushing my shoulder, tugging me closer, his breath sharp, muttering holding was my game, bet I'd pull him too far. I smirked, leaned up, my chest brushing his flirty, saying far was my win, bet he'd chase it hard. The air snapped, tension thick, and I giggled, flirty, saying he looked damn wild, bet he'd take it all. He smirked, his hand sliding to my hip, teasing, pulling me nearer, muttering wild was my spark, bet I'd blaze him out. I bumped his chest, my knee brushing his thigh, saying blazing was my rush, bet he'd fan it anyway. His grip tightened, his other hand brushing my back, light, warm, his voice low, saying fanning was my trap, bet I'd burn him raw. I grinned, my fingers tapping his shoulder, teasing, saying burning was my play, bet he'd fall for it. Then tires crunched, the front door banged, Mom's voice slicing through, yelling where we were, home a day early. I froze, rolled off, yanking my top down, heart slamming, muttering she's back, bet we're toast. Rick bolted up, smoothing his shirt, cursing, saying timing was crap, bet she'd flip out. I stumbled to the hall, Mom charging in, bags hitting the floor, eyes blazing, screaming what the hell of me in his room, drunk? I stammered it was nothing, bet she'd blow it up. She grabbed my arm, yelling at Rick he'd lost it, pack his junk, we're done. She hauled me to my room, threw my stuff in a bag, her voice cracking, shouting we're leaving, now. Rick stood in the hall, saying I'd pushed it, bet she'd see my fault, but she shoved past, dragged me to the car, peeling out, leaving him staring. I slumped, buzzed dead, knowing I'd sparked it, bet it torched us all.